Awesome. Thank you so much to those of y'all who have joined. We are going to be waiting until about 2:05 to start the webinar. This is the Central Valley Scholars Medical School webinar hosted by Cristian Gutierrez Huerta, who is here with us today. Please just hang tight until 2:05. If for anyone who might be curious, because this is a webinar and it will be recorded, we want to make sure everyone's privacy is protected. So that's why your audio and cameras are off. But we do encourage you to please use the Q&A box at the bottom right of your Zoom toolbar. The chat will be disabled for participants, but we will be, sending out some announcements and some useful links on there. So definitely check it out when we do that. And if anyone has questions already, feel free to start dropping them now or as they come up during the presentation. However, we won't get around to them until probably the end, so stay tuned for that. Awesome. It looks like we had a couple more people join. So for those of you who didn't already hear the announcement, we'll be starting at 2:05. So please just hang tight while we wait for everyone else to join the Zoom. If you have questions or comments, please put them in the Q&A box. The camera, audio, and chat are disabled for all attendees in order to protect your privacy, but we do encourage you to put questions and comments in the Q&A as soon as they come up, and we'll address them as soon as we can. We have about a minute left before we go ahead and get started, but thank you to those of y'all who have already started to drop your questions in the Q&A box. As a reminder, we'll probably address those at the very end, so stay tuned. And yeah, feel free to also leave any comments. If at any point you can't hear or see us or something goes wrong, let us know. Awesome. So it looks like it's right about time. Hopefully people will continue to trickle in throughout the presentation, but we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Katia. My pronouns are she, her, ella. I'm the events coordinator for Central Valley Scholars, and this is the medical school webinar hosted by Cristian Gutierrez Huerta, our host today, and he'll introduce himself in just a second. But before we do that, I did want to begin by giving a brief overview of some of the different programming that Central Valley Scholars offers outside of our public webinars. So this, for example, is one of our many public workshops that are going to be happening during the summer. We've had back-to-back workshops all day today. We'll actually be having one right after this on PhD programs, doctoral programs. So please attend that, check it out if if you're interested. I'll drop the link shortly, but we do these workshops year round, so definitely stay up to date on our website. We also offer mentorship programs for current high school seniors who are looking to, for someone to hold their hand through the college application process. They get paired up with femtees from similar backgrounds in the Central Valley, and they basically just help them through that process, giving them advice and resources. We also offer over $12,000 worth of scholarships every year. And yeah, they actually just closed in June, but you can definitely look into them next year. They are more for high school age students or people transitioning into undergrad, but definitely, worthwhile to check them out and share with people. We also have other programming as well. So definitely just follow us on social media and check out our website, explore it to see everything that we are up to. Since 2019, we have been an official 501c3 nonprofit made up of almost entirely Central Valley young people currently in undergrad or transitioning out. But yeah, so that's a little bit about us for some of y'all who may not have known. And yeah, with that, I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next slide, which is a land acknowledgement. This is a practice that we try to do at all of our public workshops. And although we acknowledge that maybe not everyone is in the Central Valley or from the Central Valley, we do still want to acknowledge the Yokuts territory, which comprises most of the Central Valley. But I'll also drop a link right after this so that you can find out what territory you're on if it's not the same as us. So with that, feel free to close your eyes, plant your feet on the floor, get comfortable in the space that you're in as I read this off. So I want to take a moment to acknowledge where we are, that the earth below our homes and below our feet is Yokuts territory and has belonged to and been tended to by the Yokuts people for hundreds of thousands of years. When white settlers arrived to what we otherwise know as the United States, they enacted genocide and theft of the land, labor, and resources, attempting to wipe out indigenous communities entirely. It's important to acknowledge the land we're living on and to recognize our history and relationship to the ongoing legacy of colonization in the US, and to also recognize that the Yokuts people are still here, and that through resistance and resilience are still on the front lines struggling for land rights, collective liberation, and an end to white supremacy. I invite you to take a moment and think about your relationship to this land and its territory and its history. Let's have those who have come before us in the struggle inform us on where we're going so that together we can reimagine and collectively build a world where we're all free. So if you had your eyes closed or anything like that, please come back into the space at your own pace, and I will hand it off to our host, Cristian, to introduce himself and dive right into the curriculum. Oh, Cristian, I think you're muted, so feel free to unmute whenever you're ready.
Sorry, it's just really hard to share screen and do everything else. Unfortunately, I won't be able to answer any more questions because it kind of messes up with the cursor and things. So I will get through every single question that is asked. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Cristian. I was born in San Diego at 10. We ended up moving to Tulare, California, which is in the Valley, mostly due to the high cost of living. And then I went to UC Merced and I double majored in applied math and bio. While I was in undergrad, I did a few things, a lot of things that you all likely know that you need to kind of complete in order to be a competitive applicant for medical school. And that was volunteering with the church, feeding homeless. I worked for a lot of the academic student advancement programs through the Bright Success Center over at UC Merced. I also was really involved with student organizations, namely Greek Life. And my last year, I also worked as a medical scribe in the ER over at Madera Community Hospital. After graduating, I moved over to DC and I completed a 2-year research fellowship over at the NIH. And I just finished my first year. I'm an MD PhD student at the Medical College of Wisconsin. So what that means really is that I'm in two programs kind of at the same time. So I'm doing the medical doctoral program, but I'm also doing a traditional research-based PhD. And what I wanted to start off speaking about today was really my struggle. So I think one thing that we unfortunately do when we kind of run a lot of these types of webinars, you kind of have a speaker come in and everything that they're saying sounds really incredible. And it's like, oh yeah, Christian majored in applied math and went to medical school. Like that's not really common. Or, went to NIH and did a 2-year research fellowship. Like I'm not like that, right? And I think it's normal for us to compare to other people. And so, like I said, I just really want to start off by talking about some of the struggles I have faced. And my hope is that maybe you find some motivation through my own struggles. And I think also just reaffirm the fact that you also can, one day be in medical school. So my parents are immigrants from Mexico. I'm the oldest of 5. And so, I think just growing up, you're kind of expected to learn English at a super fast rate, translating documents for my parents. I didn't just need to learn, my academics for myself, but I also had siblings. And so I was really expected to, help them with their homework because my parents, they didn't really finish anything past middle school. And so, I think just managing and navigating, the world from, my Mexican family culture with, trying to adapt into the US, I think was definitely a huge, learning experience overall, but definitely a struggle, right? When you don't just have like your normal pressure, you also have familial pressure to succeed. I think one thing that I dealt with a lot, was self-doubt and rejection. So like I said, I'm the oldest of 5, but I grew up with my stepdad. So, and I grew up knowing my biological father. He lives in Tijuana, which is right, crossing the border from San Diego. So I kind of went from being able to see my biological father on the weekends to moving, 6 hours away. We didn't really go across the border that often. And so, I think especially I was 10 years old, puberty and just kind of that preteen phase. And I just felt like I was in my home with my stepdad and my siblings, but it wasn't really my family, and I think I just dealt with a lot of things related to that. And when I was 16, I was discovered that I was gay, and that didn't really go well either with my parents. And so I felt like I was kind of just trying my best to feel comfortable being myself and just being comfortable where I'm at. And yeah, it's been a journey for sure, but I think I've definitely learned from all those things. And I think now my parents and I, we have a really great relationship. And I think we're much better for all those things that we kind of experienced. Being a first generation college student definitely has its own struggles, right? You kind of, for my parents, the goal was always college, but there was no really like what happens after college. It's like, oh, you pick a major and people are like, oh, what do you want to do with that? And it's like, I don't really know. And, you're really limited in your career options and everything that you're going through and trying to navigate this new space. For a lot of people living on their own for the first time, I think, I grew up in a very tight-knit family unit. And that just wasn't the case anymore, right? So I think there was like all these other things going on. Finding mentors was hard, trying to figure out what I'm supposed to be doing was difficult, what classes to take, or, who to talk to, how to further advance and develop oneself. There was a lot of financial hardships. So my mom was a stay-at-home mom for most of my life, up pretty much until I went to college, and she decided to open up her own business. And so this was in 2014. She decided to open up her own business. She got a business loan for that. At the same time, one of our cars broke down, and so my parents needed to get a new car. And my parents convinced me that because I had better credit at the time, that I should take the car out in my name because it would help lower their payments. And I think this is also like where you just kind of get into this mix of cultural expectations, family expectations, this whole immigrant background, and like how do we navigate all these things. And so I mean, I was the eldest. My entire free time in high school was dedicated to helping out my family. Even after the whole thing happened when I was 16 and there was rejection there, like I still got a job at 16 and wanted to help pay the bills. And so, unfortunately, 2 years later, in 2017, the business really went under. And so my mom had to declare bankruptcy. And with that, they couldn't afford to pay for the new car that they got. And so, which was under my name. And my last year of college, I actually also had to declare bankruptcy. And I think just dealing with that was quite traumatic and definitely not something I'm open about to anybody. I'd like when I was going through it in college, none of my close friends knew. And there was a lot of shame that kind of came from this. And I didn't even talk about this in my medical school application because I felt like this was going to be seen as, a reason to not take me and admit me into medical school. But the reason I'm sharing all this is because I feel like in the last year that I've been in medical school, I've definitely have a much better appreciation for being comfortable with who you are, what your life experiences, like what they've brought, who you've met, the hardships that you faced, because all of those things in the end make us stronger. And I think they also add a level of diversity to, the future physician workforce. And I think specifically to medical school, it's really difficult, everything that you need to do. And there's all these like little hidden loops. I call it the hidden curriculum that people just really don't know about. And so I spend a lot of my time really working with undergrad students and other people who want to go into medical school because I feel like there's a lot of hoops that we all have to get through. And so I feel like not knowing where to start is really the whole motivation for this whole presentation for me. And like I said, I just wanted to share all that. I know maybe some of it was a little darker, but I think we all have struggles. And I just want to tell you that if you really put your mind to going to medical school, I think you can also be very successful. And don't feel like these life experiences, a lot of time based on extraneous factors, are going to inhibit you from achieving your goals. So here's the general timeline for medicals, like becoming a physician, I should say, right? Maybe most of you are here in the pre-med undergrad phase where you are taking classes in college, kind of building up your GPA. In between there, you also have to take the MCAT. So, there was a question about this that I saw, when should you apply? And I think it really depends on how much information you have, because I think if you're a first year, you are aware of all of the requirements and I think you plan very well, then I think you can, apply straight from college directly into medical school. So my class here at MCW is about 200 people. 45 people actually came straight from undergrad. So it's totally possible. I think the biggest challenge there is making sure that you are really kind of on top of a very strict schedule if you're going to make that happen. So as you all are likely familiar, there's a medical school entrance exam called the MCAT that you need to take. So if you are able to take it at the end of your third year, then you can apply straight into medical school, right? But what a lot of people end up having to do is actually maybe take a gap year or two or maybe more, right? I personally took 2, and I took my MCAT during that time. Then you kind of go into this preclinical phase of medical school, and then you have what are called these like national board exams, step 1, step 2, and step 3. And I won't get into all that, but basically to become a physician, depending on what you want to do, let's say you go straight from undergrad and you become, let's say the fastest residencies are 3 years. And those are things like emergency medicine, family medicine, primary care. So if you were to do all that directly, That is 4 years for undergrad, 4 years for medical school, and then 3 years for residency. So that's a total of 11 years. Now, if you want to do something a little bit more involved, then those years kind of get extended, of course. But one of the things I wanted to highlight here is that there's the step 1, step 2, step 3 exams. When you actually conclude your residency, you also have a board certification for that specific specialty. And so I think the only reason really I want to share all those exams is because I think I had to have a shift in perspective when I was studying for the MCAT. For a lot of people, this is probably the biggest challenge to actually getting into medical school, and it is a very challenging exam. But I also realized that exams is also part of the career. So I think when I just had a shift in perspective from, oh, the MCAT is this checkbox that I need to hit to get into medical school, it really became more of a, no, this is actually, unfortunately, just part of the career. There's going to be step 1, step 2, step 3 exams. There's board certifications. Depending on states, you might have extra exams. Depending on your specialty, you might have to take an exam every 2 years or every 5 years or every 10 years to just continue to practice, right? So this is unfortunately just part of the career. And I think if you can start getting into that perspective now, as you're studying for the MCAT in the coming years or now, that hopefully that kind of helps motivate you. I don't know if it will. The MCAT is very challenging. So how common are gap years? So the average age of a medical school matriculant is 24.3, meaning, the average, well, I wouldn't say average, but, if you think about a traditional person going straight from high school to undergrad, 18 years old, come out at the end of 4 years, about 22 years, right? So most people end up actually taking about 2 years gap years. And there's multiple reasons why people do this. Some people want to take classes to improve their GPA. Other people might want to work because applying to medical school is very expensive. And I talk about this a little bit later too, but there's the AAMC, this is Association of American Medical Colleges, have a fee assistance program. So if you consider yourself socioeconomically disadvantaged, then they actually help pay for some of your medical school applications. And this is definitely something that I took advantage of. The other reason, in addition to classes and the fact that it's very costly, is that it's sometimes really hard to complete all of your core medical school requirements. And I'll go through a little bit more of those later, what those are and what they entail. But, I, looking back to undergrad, was extremely busy all the time. I was like, oh no, I have to volunteer and I have to go do some clinical hours and I have to go work and I have to do this and I have to do that and I have to have leadership positions. And it can get very toxic very quickly. So I think also for some people, it's like, you know what, I'm going to focus on school right now, maybe do some of those core med school requirements, but then I'm going to take a year off to really boost up my shadowing hours or work in a clinical setting, right? Whatever it is. So they're very common. So there's different sections of the application. This is a very involved application. I think for professional schools, this definitely has it beat. So you need to have a competitive GPA. So here is the average national GPA for a medical student is 3.73, and the average MCAT is 511.3. So I know for some people that might be a little bit of a scary number, the 3.73. Again, this is the average. So probably, so the spread really is probably from like 3.4 to 3.9 to 4.0, right? And I think there's multiple reasons why you could or couldn't get into school with like a specific GPA. And unfortunately, going into the specifics of that can be its own presentation. Like I said, there's a medical school entrance exam. You have to have a list of activities, which are those core medical school requirements I talked about. You have to have your personal statements. There's secondary applications. You need letters of recommendation. And if applicable, you can apply. It's like a qualifier on your application where you kind of report to the school that you are disadvantaged. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later too. So MCAT prep. So this is the recommended coursework you should take. So if let's say you are an undergrad, this is your first year, you want to apply straight into medical school from undergrad, you basically need to do all of your coursework within the first 3 years of school probably the first 2.5 years. So you can also have some time to study for the actual exam. And those are introduction and molecular biology, general chemistry, organic chemistry, biochemistry. There's so much chemistry, and I promise you, it's not the easiest to go through in undergrad, but very little chemistry actually comes up in medical school. So same thing with physics 1 and 2, but these are just things we have to do to kind of show that we are apt in our science skills and science knowledge, right? Calculus, introductory psychology, introduction to sociology, as well as 2 college level English courses. So if this is where you're at, I just wanted to share some paid resources. I think these are really great. Unfortunately, they do cost about $1,500, some more. And I know that's not accessible to everyone. This is also why some people, take those gap years to work, make some money, and then be able to afford things like this. You can also take advantage of some free resources. So Kaplan, you can go question of the day, and every single day they have a new question, like a new MCAT style question. And so that's a great way. It's free. You can go on it every day. Khan Academy has some really great MCAT test prep videos that are absolutely free on YouTube, and you should definitely take advantage. There's also some podcasts through any of the podcast app. Really, you can search MCAT prep, and you'll get a whole plethora of different resources there. And Jack Weston, which is a website, has a free CARS passage. And so these are just some free resources. Unfortunately, I think to really get a competitive score, a lot of times students end up having to use these paid resources. It's also possible that you get the books, and you can self-learn, although that takes a lot of diligence and dedication and being very strict with your timeline, which can be very challenging to do. And that's probably the greatest benefit from taking it in a class setting where you kind of feel like you have benchmarks to meet. So the MCAT has 230 questions, generally takes about 6 hours to complete. There's 4 sections: chemistry and physics, bio and biochemistry, CARS, which is, reading comprehension, essentially, and then psychology and sociology. So there's a lot of different subjects here. And that's why I kind of put those coursework in the slide before, that's really what you should be doing prior to taking the MCAT. And that's probably going to be the biggest indicator, whether you can apply to medical school directly from undergrad or if you need to take 1 or 2 years off. So here is a list of activities that you can put down in your application. This is a lot, and I don't have, unfortunately, time to go into each one, but I kind of highlighted some here that I think are really what you should do if you want to have a competitive application. Community service is something that's heavily looked on in medical school. I think, we are going into service-based careers. And so they just want to see, have you worked with people from lower socioeconomic statuses than you, people from diverse backgrounds, different races. And I think you do a lot of that through community service. You learn to also not just look at the world from your perspective, but what is it like for someone else? So volunteering both in clinical and non-clinical settings is super important. Having extracurricular activities. Hobbies is actually, for a lot of schools, if you don't have a hobby listed, they might not even look at your application, which is kind of interesting when you think about it, right? But, I think the admissions people also are aware that medical school and becoming a physician is a very stressful thing to do. So, what are your hobbies? How do you keep yourself entertained? How do you de-stress, right? That's really kind of what they're trying to get at there. Honors, awards, and recognitions, I think, are super important because they really highlight when you excel in a specific thing, right? So whether that's getting like a dean's honors or chancellor's honors lists for your grades, or it's an award through a club or some sort of recognition, those things I think helps make you stand out. Leadership is super important. I think as physicians, you really are a leader, not only within the clinical setting, but also when you're thinking about, all of society, right? I think physicians are definitely looked at, and most of the other professional schools, when you have a profession, you're kind of seen as the holder of information and knowledge and can provide some guidance to other people. Employment, I'd say, is really important, especially in the medical setting. If you can do like a scribe, or some people do EMT or phlebotomist, or there's so many different things you can do. I think even doing something outside of medicine is also super important. So for me, one of the things that I actually stressed the most was my employment through campus. And I talked about mentorship all throughout my application. I was like, as a physician, outside of my normal duties, I want to meet with URM students, underrepresented in medicine, Black, Hispanic, and other groups, to really mentor them and, help them achieve their professional goals, right? That was one of the things that I highlighted the most in my application. That has nothing to do with medicine specifically, right? Not going to be like in the clinic and going to be mentoring my patient, right? That's not necessarily it. But these are like my involvements outside of school. And I think really highlighting your passions and interests is super important. And I wish, looking back, I really only spent time doing the things I was actually interested in. Because I feel like in undergrad, I was like, oh, I need to do this, I need to do that. And you talk to somebody and they're volunteering here, and some people are working over there, and you're like, oh my God, I need to do everything. But, my better advice would be choose 2 or 3 things, do those things really well, and make sure that you are actually interested in them. And I think that's kind of is why they ask you, how many hours did you spend working in the hospital, right? If this was definitely something that you were like really passionate about, you're going to make time for it, right? Even with clubs, a club can be one of your passions. It's represented because you did 500 hours while you did, I don't know, 5 hours of community service, right? That kind of shows not a whole lot of dedication. Shadowing is super important, and research. So this whole presentation, we're not really talking about like MD schools and DO schools, but there are 2 different like medical curriculum styles that exist. And the only thing I want to highlight is, the average matriculant for an MD school, sorry, not average, but 94% of all entering medical students into an MD program have done research, compared to about 60% in the DO programs. So I think that's also just one big distinction why between like the MD and the DO schools. So the next thing I want to talk about is writing your personal statement. Unfortunately, this is a lot, but I think there's 3 questions that should be answered in it. And I've kind of prepared a full document with like sub questions to kind of just help people write their personal statement, because I meet with a lot of people to specifically talk about this. So the 3 things you should answer in the personal statement is, who are you? Own your identity, everything that you've kind of gone through, how has that shaped you? How will that help you be a physician? What does it mean to you, for you to be a medical doctor? So think skills, think, I think a physician should be caring and empathetic, right? And so what you want to do is you want to share a story about a time where you were caring and empathetic, right? And so you definitely want to address what you think is a medical doctor. And I think one thing that is really interesting, but I think really needs to be done is, what was your thought process when choosing a career? I think that shows a lot of maturity. And I think that's one thing that you definitely want to kind of come across your entire application. You want to make sure it's well written because it's a professional application, but you also want to show the admissions team that, you choosing this career took a lot of synthesizing and processing, and this is a mature decision that you are actively choosing to go and be a physician. So like I said, I prepared a whole document. So like for the first part, like what makes you unique? And then I have like follow-up questions, what is one obstacle that you've gone through? Or, do you belong to an underrepresented group? How does that shape your view of medicine? And so it's a document with about 7 questions with multiple parts per each section. And so I will send this over to Katia, and then she will mass email it to everyone who registered for the conference, so that you all can kind of have at least a starting place with how to write your personal statement. And I think the way I did this was sometimes people are like, oh, you can talk about, I don't know, your interest in like water disposal systems and like this public health perspective into your personal statement. Yes. Right. And so all the questions are really kind of designed to just get you to think about different things you can include. And then ultimately you will kind of pick and choose what your personal statement is really going to stay. But hopefully you all take advantage of that resource. When I talk to students, I think a lot of people find it really helpful. So asking for letters of recommendation, I think this is something that's really daunting for a lot of people, or like, who do I go to? And so I think you should 100% go to professors from college. So some schools have very specific requirements for who your letters have to come from. So for some schools, it's 2 professors and a research professor, or 1 professor, somebody who you did like a community service project with, and different things like that. So professors from college, it's really important that you talk to them and network and go to their office hours and really kind of build a personal relationship with them, especially when the deadline is 2 weeks away and you're kind of stressed out and be like, oh no, I need to get this done, and they're not responding to your email, right? If they know you and they really like support your decision to apply, then I think they're going to be a little bit more engaged and active and a little bit more responsive in emails and making sure that everything's submitted in time. Work and volunteer supervisors are really great, especially if they kind of tell you that you really stand out amongst the team of volunteers or the people you work with. Those are all things you definitely want them to highlight. Like I said, research is such a big component about your medical school application. I would 100% get at least 1 letter of recommendation from someone you did research with. And then physicians you've shadowed or worked with is also super important. It's kind of like oh, you want to be a physician, so I kind of have this like stamp of approval from this other physician, right? And it's kind of like they are, having you come into this whole field almost. And so I think it's really important. I think also it kind of shows your initiative to shadow and to work in clinical settings and to really understand what it means to be a physician. I think when I first decided, oh, I'm going to go to medical school, and it's like, I'm just kind of going through the motions and doing all these things. And then when I got to the hospital, I was like, oh, this is really different from what like I was expecting, right? But at least now I have kind of a template of what medicine is like. And I think that also helps you make better informed decisions. I worked in the emergency room in Madeira. I also worked in the emergency room in Washington, D.C. And in my application, I was like, oh, I've worked there for 2 years. I do not want to do emergency medicine. Like, I know I want to do medicine. Like, I got to interact with physicians and talk to patients, and I love that. But I didn't like the emergency room, right? So even all that was super useful. And I think, again, a template of what medicine is like. So disadvantaged status statement. So this is from the website. So they, in order to qualify for this, you need to show either social or economic or educational disadvantages. So some things that make you qualify is, is English your second language? Are you first generation college student? Did you work to support your family during high school or college? What social, economic, educational barriers have you overcome? And so those are all things that you can talk about. And I actually have some advice, and I'm also going to share my disadvantage statement that I wrote from my medical school application, which is a lot of the things that I had already referenced in the beginning of my presentation, actually. So advice, use vivid examples. Don't just share a sob or pity story or like, oh my God, all these things happened to me, right? I mean, yeah, it's unfortunate that all those things happened, but I think a mature person is able to take the situation at hand and really, hopefully, transform that into a positive, or like things that you learn because of those struggles. So I would say use an in spite of all this attitude, and what I mean is like, despite all these things that I went through, like I'm still a competitive applicant. I still did XYZ. I still, am here with a competitive MCAT score, tried really hard in my classes or whatever have you, right? Not oh, because I'm disadvantaged, my GPA isn't the best, right? That's not the perspective you want to have. You want to kind of say, you know what, I had all these barriers, and despite that, like, here I am, and I'm ready to go to medical school. So you're not justifying, bad grades here or an MCAT score. Like I said, we are really kind of giving the committee a little bit more context about who you are, what you had to overcome. And I think it's really important to share those things. And I know they're not always easy to share, but I think what I'll share is, so one of my medical school interviews, one of the most shocking statistics that kind of still is ingrained in my brain, that has been in my brain since October 2019 when I first heard it, was the fact that the top 5% of the socioeconomic status, families provide 80% of all the matriculating medical students. So 80% of all our doctors are coming from the top 5%, of the SES bracket. And so I think, like I said, sharing these things might not be easy, but I think it's really important because you're giving more context, and you want to also showcase that, maybe we do not have like the best MCAT score, the best GPA, but here are my challenges. I am not like your other medical school student applicants. So here's my statement. So when my mother became pregnant at the age of 17, my father denied that I was his child. In hopes of a better life, my grandmother and mother immigrated to from Mexico to San Diego. As recent immigrants, finding work was extremely difficult, and when I was born, life became even more difficult. My grandmother was a maid at a funeral home and would often take me with her if they could not find a caretaker. My mother later married my stepfather. Our family grew, and this brought more financial hardship. As the cost of living in San Diego increased, my parents decided to move to a small town in rural California and began working in agriculture. As soon as I was legally able to work, I found a job at the age of 16 to help my parents subsidize living costs. In high school, I applied to 81 scholarships so that my parents would not worry about funding a college education. Dealing with imposter syndrome as a first-generation college student was difficult, but I'm grateful for the various mentors who have helped me develop academically and professionally. Despite life's obstacles, I hope to demonstrate that success is attainable as long as one has a grit and determination to see one's goals through. So, I talked about some pretty heavy things, within the statement, but again, the perspective isn't, oh, look at my life, it sucks, right? It's kind of really, what, this is who I am, and this just kind of gives you a little bit more context into who I am and what kind of applicant, what kind of future physician I will be, right? Because all these life experiences, I will always carry them with me. And I will bring that with me into the clinical setting when I'm actually speaking with the patient, and they're talking about, what, I have to move because XYZ, or we can't find a caretaker, right? I can draw on my own experiences to connect with people about all those things. So again, I know this isn't the funnest thing to maybe write, but I think it's also super great for like reflection, because as I wrote my medical school application, I was like, wow, like this is my life. This is really kind of like the things that I've gone through. But, regardless of all that, like I'm here and I did all these really great things and am going to be successful, and I think that in itself is like really self reassuring for myself. Sorry for using self so many times. Okay. So in addition to, so when you apply to medical school, you have a primary application, which is your personal statement and your grades and stuff like that, the MCAT, that gets sent to every single school. But then each school has like an individual application. Those are called secondaries. So 90% of schools require a secondary application. So these are generally more specific. So your personal statement, you're not writing, oh, I want to go to Stanford Medical School, right? All you're kind of talking about is, oh, here's the things I've done. Here's why I want to go to medical school. Here's the kind of physician I want to be, right? Very generic. And then when you choose your actual schools, they'll send you a second application. And those, like I said, are more specific. So they require a lot of research and sometimes even some networking, because they'll ask you, why do you want to go to the school? Or what will you contribute to a student body? Or what is your experience working with diverse groups of people? Or what is your knowledge about, health disparities in Milwaukee, where I go to school? And it's like, oh, well, they want to obviously get someone who wants to help the community in Milwaukee here at Medical College of Wisconsin. So, oh, I have to go do some research on the local population so I can, have substantial things to say, or go and look at student clubs and organizations so I can really find reasons why I actually want to go to school, right? Because especially for medical school, I feel you are like, oh, this is my GPA, this is my MCAT. You kind of maybe go online and you're like, okay, based on those statistics, I should be applying to these schools. And maybe you apply to University of Alabama, Birmingham, and they're like, well, you're from California or from wherever. Why do you want to come to Alabama? And so I think they'll actually ask you those questions. And so I think it's really important to be knowledgeable and do a lot of research. Also, I think if you all have a chance to, improve like typing speed, that's actually helps so much. In addition to just practice writing, like professional writing, because for most schools, they'll give you only 2 weeks to submit your applications. And if you apply to 15 schools and they all send them the secondary application to you at the same time, and they're all due in 2 weeks, then you're kind of scrambling and you really don't have time to like edit your applications. Secondary applications is probably like the worst time for me in the whole application cycle. So the cost of applying, it is very costly. So the primary application is, to send it out to the first school is $170, and basically to send it out to any other school is about $40. So as you can tell, it gets pretty expensive really quickly, right? So if you're applying to 11 schools, then that's basically $400 for here and $170. And that alone is already, $570. And the average secondary application cost is $100. So if you apply to 14 schools, you, in addition to these 570, you have an extra $1,100 that you have to pay in secondary application fees, right? So together, that's already $2,000 for about 11 applications. So again, look into the fee assistance program by the AAMC. I think that'll be really helpful. So funding sources for medical school. So it's really expensive. So some medical schools will cover your entire tuition. So those schools include Kaiser Permanente, UCLA, Cleveland, Cornell, NYU, Columbia, Washington University. I think one thing you'll also notice is these schools are also extremely, extremely competitive to get into. And so I think the fact that they have free tuition definitely, helps them boost, their GPA and MCAT requirements. So most students are on federal loan. So the average debt coming out of medical school is about $232,000. Now that sounds pretty hefty. It's basically the cost of a house. So there are scholarship programs, of course. Some will fund most things. Some probably only cover like specific sections. So there's the National Health Service Corps. So this is where you basically work with the government and they pay for your school. And in exchange, whenever you're done with your training, you will go work for the government for 3 years or something, whatever it is that you negotiate. So some people do that because it's free medical school and, you kind of have like a secure job coming out of residency too. There is National Medical Fellowships. And so I go to school here at the medical college and I'm in the MSCP program. So that's my MD PhD program. And I actually get to go to medical school and pay $0 in tuition, which is great. So tips on how to get started. So keep attending, events like these and keep networking with medical students and just talk to people and be like, hey, what should I be doing? Here's a progress. Like, do you think I should be adding anything else? How are my hours for clinical shadowing? Like, do we think we need to boost those, or, maybe you're struggling. You're saying, well, I only have 12 viable hours in a day. I can't be involved in all these things. How should I prioritize? Right. And I think the best people to talk about those questions is people like myself, medical students and other people in healthcare. So reach out to people like myself. You know, if you have your own network or one of your friends, you know, one of your friends' siblings, cousins, wife is in medical school, like reach out to them, you know, just talk to as many people as you can. You know, physicians are just people. You can even talk to your primary care physician. You know, I actually, some of my friends started shadowing their actual primary care physician, right? That's an easy access that you already have when you go in for your annual checkup. And one of the things I learned is to always apply to internships and opportunities. I think that's been the biggest, you know, factor in me being where I'm at. It's like, oh, there's this research opportunity. Okay, I'm going to apply. Why? Because, well, they pay you to do research, but then you're in this program. And through the program, I got mentors, and then they started sending me other opportunities, right? Or the whole entire reason I went to NIH was because I was doing research for the summer. I went to go present it at a conference. At the conference, they had like a tabling fair. And that's when I met with one of the directors for the specific fellowship that I applied to at NIH, right? And so I applied to go to University of Alabama, Birmingham to do a research internship like over the summer of 2017. So applied to this research opportunity. That led me to having a poster that I could present at a conference. And then going to that conference led me to my fellowship over in DC, right? So all these things are kind of connected. And I think the other really important aspect with that is we're all limited to whatever we know about, if that makes sense. So, you know, I know about opportunities happening here in Milwaukee and over at the Medical College of Wisconsin, right? If you connect with me, then I can forward you and say, oh, you know what? They're looking for an undergrad student to do summer, like research over the summer, right? And now you have access to that opportunity by me. And so that's really why networking is so important. And just constantly applying to opportunities and to internships and just kind of diversifying your skill set. So the other thing is like keep track of who you connect with. You know, if you connect with me, write my email, say this is where we met, this is what we talked about. You know, so when you reach out maybe a year or 2 years later when you're actually applying, it's like, oh hey, Christian, I attended your seminar on, you know, this Saturday and we talked about these things and you said that you would help me with this and this, right? It's like, okay. And so now when I get that email, I'm like, okay, cool. Like this is how we know each other and this is why I'm going to help, right? And also, you know, what activities you're doing. Oh, I volunteered here this week and I volunteered there this next week, right? It's a lot easier to remember what you did a week ago than what you did 1 year ago. And I had that problem when I was drafting my application. I was like, oh wait, I did that 4 years ago. Like, what did I actually do? How many hours did I do it for? Right? And you're just kind of scrambling at the end. So I think keeping track of all those things is really important. And I think that's pretty much my last slide.
Oh, yay. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much, Christian. And then I know you have that QR code so people can take a picture or start scanning it if they are interested. Also, the email is super helpful. I can also type it in the chat if maybe it's easier for people to copy paste.
Mhm.
But I'll be turning my camera on in just a second. I lost the ability to when I made you host again, so I'll turn it on in just a second. But for those of y'all who have had questions, thank you so much for putting them in the Q&A box. But please continue to do that. We, depending on how many questions we get, we'll kind of go through them until we reach time at 3 o'clock. So we have about 5 minutes. But yeah, please go ahead and use the Q&A box. And in the meantime, if Christian, you have any other words of advice or things that you'd like to say.
Yeah. I'm happy to take any questions. You know, I'm here as a resource.
Yes, and thank you so much too for being willing to share your email. I know sometimes it can be, doesn't always work out that way, or sometimes hosts prefer to just maybe have them contact Central Valley Scholars instead of contact them. So super helpful. Thank you so much. And yeah, what a great piece of advice to right? Like just even if it is maybe a couple years out before people actually start applying or need to reach out. It's just good to know that, you at least have someone you can refer back to and talk to just to have options. But yeah, okay, perfect. So not seeing anything in the Q&A box so far, but in the meantime, I'm gonna go ahead and drop the link to a feedback survey that everyone can please fill out. It'll take less than a minute. It's really just a couple questions asking you about your knowledge before and after attending the workshop. Also, someone just dropped a question. They said, anything or anyone in particular that you help in pre-med?
I think that helped me in
Okay.
pre-med. So I'd say, yes, I think my biggest help was when I'm like, I think it was definitely my mentor. So one of the reasons I went to UC Merced is because I applied to the scholarship through the mathematics department at UC Merced. And with that, I got paired up with a professor. And so it was really great because he kind of followed me for 5 years while I was in undergrad. And he would really kind of start pushing, it's like, oh, like, what are you thinking about doing career wise? And like, have you thought about this? He's the entire reason I did research in the first place. He's like, okay, so you have an applied math degree. So when I started college, I was just an applied math major. He's like, have you thought about research or like about doing PhD? And I was like, no, not really. And then he's like, oh, there's this really great internship through the US Department of Energy working at a genomics laboratory. And he's like, here's the application, you should go apply. And I did, and I absolutely loved it. And so that was in between my second and third year. And then I was like, you know what, I like biology too. So I decided to double major that like fall semester of my third year. And that's really why it took 5 years to graduate. So I was pretty late, taking general chemistry and organic chemistry with freshmen while I was a third and fourth year. But I'd say that was like a lot of college, just kind of figuring out like, oh, you should be applying to these opportunities and doing those things. I think what really helped after that, though, was my 2 gap years where I was really working with physicians, for physicians, doing clinical research. And so I think having those mentors was, I think, the biggest help. And so that's why I suggest, talk to medical students, talk to physicians. They're the ones who are really going to be the ones to actually guide you because they've done it themselves, right? Even my mentor from college, who helped me get all these opportunities, he was a PhD in mathematics. So he wasn't really going to sit down and be like, oh, you should go do some clinical volunteering or you should go do this and that. Also, peers were incredibly helpful. I joined Phi Delta Epsilon over at UC Merced, which is a pre-medical fraternity. And just talking to other people, and it's like, oh, you're doing research. Maybe I should do research. Oh, you're like volunteering at the hospital. Why am I not doing that? And so I think having that peer network is also super useful and helpful. So if there's like clubs or organizations at your local undergrad, I would definitely get connected there because they're the ones that are on your actual level, doing the things that you should be doing. I forgot about the you. So it's like, but yeah.
Awesome, thank you. And then I just dropped a couple of links in the chat. So while we wait for maybe a couple more questions to come in, I did just want to go over what those are. I dropped a link to the feedback survey. It'll take 1 to 2 minutes, so please fill that out now. We'll also be sending it in a follow-up email as well as this might be a separate follow-up email, but we'll be notifying you all and everyone who has RSVP'd to let them know once the recording of this webinar is posted on our website. It'll be found under centralvalleyscholars.org/resources. You can also find all of our past webinar recordings on there, including the medical school presentation from last summer. So you can kind of compare the two and rewatch them as many times as you need to. And then there's also a link to register for our remaining summer workshop, which will be happening. It'll be starting at 3:30. So we'll take a break and then we'll be coming back to this Zoom. It'll be led by one of our Central Valley Scholars staff who's currently doing research. So I know Cristian has talked about that a lot. So if anyone is interested in maybe being like Cristian and doing both, feel free to attend that workshop as well. But we're at time and there's no more questions. So it looks like we're good to end here. Thank you all so much for coming and for staying until the end and for all of your wonderful participation. I'll hand it back to you, Christian, in case there's any last minute piece of advice that you'd like to share. Otherwise, we're good to go.
No, I'm good. Please follow up on an email if you have specific questions or just want to connect. More than happy to help in any way I can.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you, Christian. And we'll go ahead and end it here. But thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your weekend. Have a good one. Bye-bye.